All right, Matt, there's a lot of news to discuss, so let's discuss the most important piece first, which is the new EA Sports college football game that's going to return with name, image, and likeness. You've been all over this. You've been the main guy on this. What's the latest with that video game? Because I will be buying this next year.
I think you and just about everybody under 50 who listens to this broadcast and almost everybody else throughout the country, it's going to be an extremely anticipated title. And it is good news. Last week, EA communicated to ESPN and a few of their other partners here that One Team Partners is going to be the entity that's facilitating the group license program. And what that means in English is that this is the company that's going to help distribute the agreement to get athletes paid to use their actual name and likeness to appear in the video game. If you played it over the last decade, you'll know that when you picked up the game, it would say QB3, and they would have a randomized individual rather than the people actually on the team. According to the individuals that I've spoken to that were a part of that bidding process and have been talking to EA, we're not looking at big money. We're looking at $500, $600, $700-ish per athlete appearing in the game. But there's going to be over 10,000 athletes in this game if everybody actually signs up to be a part of it. And I get the feeling here from my conversations with current athletes, they'll be more than happy to take that money. As long as they throw in a free copy of the game, they're going to be excited, and that's going to make an even more authentic experience for everybody when they play this thing next summer.
It'll be so fun. I still have a PlayStation 3 with 2014, which is the latest edition, and still download the rosters that someone painstakingly makes throughout the summer. But with the transfer portal, it's got to be even crazier right now. So I imagine, like most EA Sports games, that they'll provide some kind of update in August where you can get the latest rosters, because now the transfer portal has changed the game in that way.
You're right. I think people forget about this because the last game, right, in 2014, that was before, I was 2 video game consoles ago, and that was before we were constantly online for any, console experience. And so a roster update every 2 or 3 weeks, which is what happens with Madden and FIFA and the NBA 2K series, like that's going to be a part of this. There's even some potential financial reasons where that may be important, because there's typically an ultimate team mode, and there are mechanisms to maybe pay athletes or schools more money for things that happen in Ultimate Team or happen with DLC, a different kind of royalty agreements. But yeah, I would expect in many ways a very different experience from people that are still keeping their old video game systems. And you can't see this here in my office. I still have an Xbox 360 with the old game on there too.
My guy.
When I boot the thing up, it sounds like a plane is taking off. Like I might not make it until next summer. They're not built for this. And I know I'm not the only reporter that has a similar setup where they are.
Is that the lawnmower? No, that's the Xbox 360. Matt has fired it up in his basement. Just everyone calm down. Okay, there's a lot going on with expansion talk and realignment and Pac-12 contracts and UConn and San Diego State and whatnot. What are you seeing and what are you thinking about what's going on right now this summer?
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to track, even if this is like literally your beat, like it is for me, where I don't even really write about a whole lot of what's happening on the field and spend so much of my time as a reporter talking to the lawyers and the media consultants and the third-party groups that help broker these kind of agreements, trying to track what's actually happening versus what is an interested party trying to negotiate through the media in public is very difficult. So you're gonna see and you hear a lot of things we have here for a while. I think if I was a BYU fan, one thing I would just want to become comfortable with as a new member here of the Big 12 is that you have conference leadership that is willing to try almost anything to increase their revenue, to increase their marketability and their exposure, not just throughout the country, outside of the footprint in places like New York and Los Angeles, but potentially Mexico City, potentially Monterey, potentially globally. So that means you're gonna hear a lot, and some of those ideas aren't going to come to fruition. Some of those will, and they won't be as successful, and some of them will, and they will be very successful. And if you're used to a more staid, conservative, traditional conference leadership that maybe BYU has enjoyed in other leagues, and that's okay, that's not what the Big 12 is right now. I would be pretty surprised if the Big 12 ends up actually taking UConn. And part of that is because I'm pretty skeptical based on what I've heard as a reporter right now that UConn would even accept that. But there's a lot of things that may end up happening that if you had asked fans or asked a lot of reporters a year and a half ago if that was reasonable or possible with the Big 12, the answer would be no. And so I can see that is something that could be very exciting and maybe a little frustrating, but mostly exciting, I think, for fans in this market over the coming months.
When BYU entered the Big 12, which officially they'll join in July 1st, but in September of 2021, we did not anticipate the Pac-12 versus Big 12 sort of rivalry that sort of spawned from BYU, Utah, and whatnot. But any Pac-12 TV contract news or lack thereof is a Big 12 and BYU news, which is super interesting. We did not see this. What's your anticipation of sort of what could or maybe won't happen relative to expansion or teams leaving the Pac-12, or San Diego State, who reportedly would owe $17 million by July 1st if they leave, but that goes up to $51 million if they don't leave by July 1st? What's your sense of what could or may not happen there?
Yeah, if you're looking at the full spectrum of what could and could not happen, I mean, the whole thing's on Twitter right now, right? You have a whole like group of experts, some of whom have expertise, so some of them definitely don't. And it's funny because I think the BYU-Utah dynamic is actually one of the reasons that this rivalry has really kind of blown up on social media, and a sense of tribalism around the Big 12, which absolutely did not exist like 2 years ago. Now that's a thing. What I can share based on what individuals with direct information have told me over the last couple of months is that schools that are currently in the Pac-12 would prefer to stay in the Pac-12. All things being equal, they value the academic prestige. They value being able to count some of these other institutions as their peers, and they value a deep presence in California, not just to recruit athletes, but to recruit potential students. If the money and the access between the Pac-12 and the Big 12 became so enormous, or the exposure became so enormous that they would be breaking their fiduciary responsibility to leave, then yes, then you could see a couple of schools potentially leave. But that's not where we are, and that's not where we've been for several months, which is why Utah and the Arizonas and Colorado are still in this league. As best as I've been told, the Pac-12 is talking to a lot of people, and not very many entities have completely said we're out. They're still talking to ESPN. They've talked to multiple streaming partners. They've had some conversations with smaller linear channels here. When this actually happens, is a guess as good. Your guess is as good as mine, because what we've heard from the presidents and what we've heard from some of the industry folks have been deadlines and expectations that have been blown through. I will say, it is very unusual for this process to be as noisy as it's been. Television contract negotiations for major conferences are really complicated. Just ask the Big Ten, who just, as administrators, are finding out that deal they signed with Fox and CBS and NBC maybe last summer isn't the deal that they have right now. But you don't typically hear as much leak out into the media, and there are some reasons for that. I understand why fans are frustrated. It will probably be resolved this summer.
It's super interesting because, yes, it feels, when everyone says, yeah, we're good, it feels like, well, we assumed you were good. Why'd you have to tell us? It's an interesting sort of PR campaign there. Did want to finish with this.
Yeah.
The transfer portal certainly has affected everybody in college football. BYU has signed something like 18 or 19 guys post last season, which is the most in the transfer portal era. In fact, it's all the other years combined. I wonder if the traditional high school athlete is going to be valued less everywhere for transfer portal guys, but especially at BYU, where sometimes when those kids go on missions, you have a unique perspective, not a BYU guy per se, but a member of the church, where you understand the dynamic here. BYU is trying to compete right now. I wonder how many of those kids are going to be at BYU versus the past, given the transfer portal, where BYU can't afford to wait 5 years for them to be ready. And a transfer portal guy, in theory, is ready right away. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think BYU is a really fascinating market for how they're going to view high school talent moving forward. This is a concern I've heard from coaches and ADs and high school coaches in multiple sports for a while. And I think in some markets, particularly the Intermountain West, that are not as heavily scouted as, say, Dallas or South Florida or the Great Lakes. They don't have as many major camps. It's more expensive to get evaluators and other people out there to go looking. Then it would be easier for maybe a good high school player to be overlooked. And somebody that, 10 years ago might have gone to Utah State might end up in the Big Sky or at a JUCO. Somebody who out of high school might have gone to BYU 10 years ago might end up at Utah State. It's really important. It's always been important. But I think it is especially important now for BYU heading into the Big 12 in multiple sports to substantially upgrade the median athletes talent-wise in order to compete. This is not a league where you're going to be competing against an Ohio State or an Alabama, every single week where they have 55-star guys, but it is a league where the depth of high 3-star, low 4-star talent is much stronger than it's been for the back end of BYU schedules here for a while. And as players get hurt, it isn't so much can your top 22 compete with Oregon State and TCU and Baylor. It's the guys that are on the two deep or farther below who need to start playing important snaps in October and in November. And for a lot of reasons, it's going to be difficult for BYU to sign a lot of 4-star guys out of high school. It's going to be difficult in an NIL era where they're playing a different game than maybe some of the schools they're recruiting. And when players have a couple of years of college experience under their belt, they become a little bit more mature. They have a better idea about what's really important to them. They may become more attractive transfer candidates. I think it's going to be easier for BYU to get guys with higher level physical measurables through the portal than it might be out of high school, particularly if they're chasing athletes who are outside of Utah, maybe outside the Book of Mormon belt. But I can definitely understand that if you're an under-the-radar high school player whose dream school is BYU, the bar is going to be a little bit higher for you. And I think that in order to get there, and I think that's going to be true for Boise State. I think that's going to be true for some schools in the Mountain West. I think that's going to be true for major programs that are not in gigantic metropolitan areas that produce 45 blue-chip kids a season.
Is the Book of Mormon belt I-15 and I-80? What are we talking about specifically?
I've heard this called the Jello Belt. I've heard this called a couple of different things. I look at it like southern Idaho, down through Utah, into like Mesa and some of these Phoenix suburbs, a couple of the Vegas suburbs, maybe part of LA, right? Like
yep.
that's where most of our people live, and that's where most of the elite high school athletes who happen to know what EFY is tend to live. There's not as many of them here in my neck of the woods in Chicago.
I think they've even changed that to something else now, right? What is it, SFY or something? It's all over the. What is it?
That just goes to show.
SFY.
I'm old and out of touch. My bad.
FSY. I don't even know what it is. And randomly Laie, Hawaii. Matt, we appreciate the time.
Yeah, them too.
Great insight as always, and we encourage people to check your Extra Points newsletter out. How do they subscribe?
You bet. You can find Extra Points at www.extrapointsmb.com or on Twitter at MattBrownEP. It's a newsletter that covers business, political, and policy issues within college athletics. It's read by athletic administrations and students all over the state and throughout the country. And if it's interesting to them, it may be interesting to you too.
Matt, thanks for the time, man.
It's always my pleasure.